Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is episode 3 in my Homelab series, and today we're going to be talking about Proxmox, which is a hypervisor or piece of software that allows you to run VMs on machines. And so we're going to be going over how I've semi-automated the creation of these VMs with Cloud-init templates, how I fully automated provisioning them with Ansible, and how I monitor them with Prometheus. Throughout this video, we're actually going to spin up a brand new VM from the template. We'll provision it, and we'll see it pumping its data into Prometheus. We'll also take a look at what I'm actually running on these VMs, how I've organized them, and sort of my future plans with them. So let's hop over into Proxmox and jump right in.
All right, let's begin our journey. So this is Proxmox, and if you didn't watch my other videos, I'm hosting it on an old Dell R720. And Proxmox is a hypervisor. So as I said earlier, hypervisor is just a fancy term for software that can run multiple virtual machines. And in fact, to film this video, I learned that it originated from the IBM 360 mainframe line back in the 1960s. So I guess supervisor used to be a common term for a kernel. And so the hypervisor was the supervisor of supervisors. Hyper is greater than super, I guess. Anyway, let's start with storage. So I have a couple places where I can store the VMs in my Proxmox instance. One of them, as I touched on in my TrueNAS video, is my TrueNAS instance. So there's something like 20 terabytes of storage available to me here. It's mounted as an NFS instance, and I can use it for VM storage. And then I've got another ZFS pool actually on the machine running Proxmox. And I think it's in a really low RAID configuration, and it's a bunch of SSDs, and essentially it's 2 terabytes. And so what I usually do is I'll run the boot disk of a VM on this fast local storage, and I'll mount a folder on the NAS for whatever services are running on that VM to store its data folders or any files that the VMs need to transfer amongst themselves, that sort of thing. But it is possible to host the VM entirely off the NAS. I think I showed that in another video. And then we'll talk briefly about backup. So another nice thing about attaching the NAS is that you can back up all the VMs on a regular schedule to the NAS. So if we take a look at my main backup job here, you can see most of my VMs, the ones I care about anyway, every Sunday at 1 in the morning, they do entire backups to the NAS, which is pretty cool. And I think I keep 2. So I keep 2 copies. I have 2 snapshots that account for 2 weeks worth of changes basically for every VM. So that's pretty nice. And then if we go over here, Proxmox can be a little overwhelming, the UI, when you first dive into it. It took me quite a while to get comfortable looking at this. But on the left, you can see all the VMs I've spun up. They have a little green arrow if they're on. And so I want to talk about my naming convention. So some of these have just random names, you'll notice, but usually I have their purpose dash a number. And you always start with whatever dash 1 because you're eventually going to want 2 of them. So for example, I only have 1 VM that's hosting games, in this case, just a Minecraft server. Someday I'll probably have more. And so it's really easy to have game-1 and then make game-2. This is actually a naming convention I stole from what we do at work, but I find that it makes things very clear. And then I've also got something called control 1. So this is a VM I use to provision other new VMs from, and it's hosting some of the monitoring software like Prometheus and Grafana, and I'll show that. And then I've got what I call workers. So I have 4 of them right now. Only one of them's really doing anything. And I'll get into, at the end of the video, sort of future plans for leveraging these more in a sort of a load balancing type way. And so this is Proxmox. What we're going to do is actually spin up a brand new VM. And so what I've done is created a template. And there's this thing in the Linux world called Cloud-init. And basically it's really nice. So I can spin up from this template and it'll inject my username and some SSH keys. So what's really nice about this is we'll make this new VM and I'll instantly be able to SSH into it from this machine that I'm on right now, which is really slick. I'll link to a handful of videos in the description for how to set up this template and how I figured out how to do it. There's plenty of good YouTube videos out there on that. But essentially, I have this template that I made back when 20.04 was LTS. I don't know what it is now. And so I can clone this guy. I'll do a full clone, and then we'll give it a name. So let's do VM YouTube. And then we'll clone that. And over on the left, we'll see this VM is kind of doing its thing. And right now, it's just a direct clone of that template. And if we go look at its hardware, it's got a really small disk, 2 gigs. So there's probably way better ways to do this. This is something I'd like to improve. But this is what I do. I clone my template, and then over here, I'm actually SSH'd into the Proxmox machine, and it has some CLI utilities that let you manipulate the VMs. And so you can say QM resize, and I think, let's go back. That guy was, all the VMs get a number. This was VM number 108, and that's how Proxmox references them. It's kind of a unique identifier. So we'll say on its disk, let's give it, I don't know, 20 more gigabytes. Something like that. And then if we go back over to Proxmox and refresh, you can see now the hard disk is much bigger. It's over 20 gigabytes. So this is kind of the first sort of manual set of steps I do to make a new VM, and then we'll spin it up. And so I just press start there, and we can go look at the console, and there it goes. So I probably don't really need to get into what a cloud template is. The other YouTube videos I'll link to, we'll go over that. But basically, this thing's gonna boot itself up and get all provisioned and updated. So we'll let it do its thing, and I'll be back in a couple minutes probably. Okay, so this thing's all set up. Takes about 2 minutes, probably because my template is so old and it has to do so many updates. So I probably need to look into making a fresher template with a newer version of Ubuntu. But at any rate, it just finished. I haven't done anything else. And so I can go over to my terminal. This is on my Windows machine here, and we can SSH into VM YouTube. And you'll see I'm immediately able to SSH in because the template has my SSH keys baked in that I use in my Homelab, which is really cool. And I'll show you a couple other things. So just for demonstrating how I provision the rest of the software on these, we can say which Docker. Docker's not on this one. The next thing I would do is I go over to that machine I had mentioned earlier that I call Control 1. And in Control 1, I have some Ansible playbooks. And so I use Control 1 to provision software onto all the other machines. So set them up with Prometheus so that I can monitor them, and I'll show that in one moment. Install Docker, things like that. And so I have this little script here. So I can say, let's bootstrap a machine called VM YouTube. So I need to SSH in. And so Control 1 also has that SSH key. So that it actually already knows how to talk to VM YouTube without passwords or anything like that. And so what's going to happen here is it's going to go off and install the node exporter for Prometheus so that I can get a bunch of stats from that VM. It's also going to install Docker. And then maybe more importantly, it's going to mount the NFS share to a certain location on that VM that I mount to on all the VMs. So we'll let this thing go off and do its thing. It's going to take a minute or two, and then I'll come back and show you what I was talking about. All right, it's all finished up. I think it took like 30 seconds. And so let's go have a look at our new VM. So let's go into VM YouTube, and we're here. And remember, before Docker wasn't here, now it is. And there's also a mount point on my TrueNAS server. So in /mount lab, you can see there's some folders and stuff in here. This wasn't here before. The Ansible scripts actually did all the work to mount this and make sure that it mounts every time this thing reboots and everything. And if we go over to browse my Gemini 2 share, which is, I go over all this in my TrueNAS video, I have a folder called lab, and I mount this to all those VMs you saw in Proxmox. And you can see there's this machine doesn't do anything yet because it's brand new, but you can see some of the other VMs are hosting some services and actually leveraging this lab mount point. And so, for example, we can say hi from YouTube, And if I go back to Windows, here's the file I just wrote to the share from the VM. We can say, hello back. And so, and there's our changes, obviously. So yeah, that's a sort of a strategy I've recently come up with to share data across these machines, and also have just one place where they can dump large amounts of data, and I don't have to worry about the boot disks growing or anything like that. It's just dumping it on the NAS. So now what we can do is take a look at what else Control 1 is up to. So on these machines, I also, the ones I've provisioned anyway, I also have a folder that I call deploys. And so in here on Control 1, I'm running 3 services, Prometheus, Graphite-exporter, I'll get to that in a minute, and Grafana. And these all correspond to a Docker instance that's running. This is just a convention I've come up with. And so one last thing we need to do, and this is something I'd like to automate, is now VM YouTube is spitting out metrics that Prometheus and Grafana will be able to understand, but we're not actually scraping them. So Prometheus is able to reach out and ask the machines, hey, give me metrics about yourself. That's basically how it works. And so let's take a look at my Docker Compose file. So I just use Docker Compose for all the services I'm running because it's just easy to restart them and configure them and do mount points. And so here, this is Prometheus that I'm running on Control 1, and you can see it actually stores its data on the mount point on the NAS. So this VM doesn't actually have to grow or anything as more and more Prometheus metrics come in, and then it even stores its configuration. So this is the one we care about. Let's take a look at that. So here, this is probably a whirlwind tour if you haven't used this stuff before. But long story short, this is the list of machines to get data from so that I can graph things in Grafana. And so all we have to do here, and again, this is something that I'd like to automate in the future. So let's add VM YouTube to our list here. Let's restart Prometheus. There it goes. And if we do Docker, we can see that Prometheus has been up for a few seconds. And now let's actually go look at Prometheus. So this is the UI for Prometheus. Again, it's a database that just stores information. And so if we refresh this, it's rebooting. So it hasn't scraped a bunch of these, and you can see they're starting to go green again. But long story short, you can see now it knows about the VM we created together just a few moments ago. And eventually, I think every 30 seconds, it'll scrape the VM and find information about it. And when I say scrape, this is what I mean. So VM YouTube is actually hosting on 9100/metrics a bunch of stuff about itself. Disk reads, things like that. This is a standard open source exporter that you can Google. It's just called Node Exporter. And so what's pretty cool now is that over in Grafana, and Grafana is a tool that allows you to visualize the data Prometheus is storing. You'll hear them used interchangeably, and usually they're used together. But I'm using Grafana to visualize my Prometheus data, basically. And so Grafana has a bunch of open source and free dashboards you can find. This is a pretty nice dashboard I found that just knows how to understand the default Node Exporter stuff. So let's refresh this to make sure we're getting the latest data. So this is the last 15 minutes of Control 1. So the machine I was just on, and you can see it kind of had a spike in network traffic as it was provisioning and talking to the VM YouTube we just made. And it has all my machines in here. So what's interesting is the one we just made and told Prometheus to start scraping. We can take a look at that. And here is the first 15 minutes of that VM we just spun up. And I can view it all here in Grafana. I can set up alerts, which I haven't done yet, but I could alert if this machine went down or it was running out of RAM or something. I think you get the idea. So that's the full end-to-end flow of creating a VM in my Proxmox instance, provisioning it with my VM I call Control 1 and my Ansible scripts I've written. And now we can see data from that VM that we just created together flowing into Grafana. And so I wanted to make a quick side note. So back on Control 1, I had this other service running called Graphite-exporter. And so what this can do is take a a graphite export that TrueNAS is capable of creating, transform it into something that Prometheus can scrape, and so you can have a dashboard about your TrueNAS server. So here, and this is like, I literally just kind of got this working last night. So I'll link below to a TrueNAS forum thread where someone was kind enough to provide this dashboard, and I was part of the thread actually, and I'll show my Docker file and stuff in there too, along with a bunch of other links that I found for how to get this working. In fact, I might make a YouTube video dedicated just to getting TrueNAS data into Prometheus, because it was a little bit of an ordeal. But anyway, this is a work in progress. You can see some of the graphs aren't working, but I can see all the temperatures of all my disks. I can see the uptime of the system, its overall load. You get the idea. So that's another thing I just hooked up recently that I've been playing around with. So now I think what we'll do is we'll go take a look at one of the workers that is actually doing things and hosting stuff, and I'll show you another use case I have and how I use these things. All right, so I wanted to give a few examples of stuff I'm actually hosting with these VMs and things I use pretty regularly. So let's SSH into worker 1. And again, I have this convention I've come up with where I have this folder called deploys, and this happens to be running one thing called transmission. And it's of course just a Docker instance. And so let's go over to the web interface. So as you might expect, on worker 1, I have this app being hosted. So this is a torrent software called Transmission. I think I've been using it for like 15 years. It's open source. It's simple. It does everything you want. Some of the other ones are so sketchy. I keep coming back to it, and it's under active development. And so if we want to download a torrent, it's nice that it has this web interface, because it's always running. It's just sitting here. So let's say we want to download this Linux Mint distribution. We can copy the torrent link, just go like this, paste it in, click add, and wait a moment. So if I'm on my network, I can load worker 1 9091 on my phone and pause things and see the progress of things, which is pretty nice. And I, of course, only use this to download Linux distributions. I don't know what else it would be good for. But anyway, this machine, if we go back to worker 1, also, as you might expect, has the lab mount, and transmission is spitting data out into a transmission folder. And when that one gets, it's cruising now. So this is legitimately actually a really fast, good way to download Linux distributions. It's gonna be done in less than a minute. So in the transmission folder, the way it works, it keeps track of stuff that's not done yet. So here's the partially downloaded ISO. And then when it's done, transmission will move it to this complete folder. It's on the NAS, so I'm not wasting space on the boot disk. And then from there, I can move it wherever I need to. So that's one cool thing I like to host. I find it very useful and just easy to use. So let's also go take a look at game 1. So as you're probably expecting, I have a deploys folder, and Minecraft is in there. So we can take a look at that Docker file. So I've started using this ITZG Minecraft server. Highly recommend it. I used to use like host MineOS or whatever that was. It was cumbersome. It was a nightmare to upgrade Java on it. And this thing has just worked. I've been using this for pushing a year now, probably. So highly recommend this. And so, as you might expect, if I am over here in Minecraft, I can go to game 1. That's the only one being hosted right now. You can host multiple on different ports, of course. Click join. And here we are. This is the server being hosted on game 1. I have a proxy with a real DNS endpoint that I'm not going to tell you about. For my friends, I think it's in Cloudflare right now, that kind of tunnels into this VM, which is pretty cool. And then I have highly recommend using an allow list. Don't just let anyone in. But yeah, this isn't a security overview video. So yeah, that's another thing I'm hosting. And that's been really fun to mess around with. I would like to host some other stuff on game 1 and maybe more game 2, 3, however many I need. I'd really like to host like an old school Counter-Strike server with like admin mod installed. I tried really hard to get a Return to Castle Wolfenstein server hosted, but no such luck yet. But yeah, that's some of the stuff I'm hosting, and I know this was a little bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully you enjoyed it.
All right, so if you made it this far, definitely appreciate it. I know that was a lot kind of all at once. So I just wanted to mention that I'm sort of iterating this as I go. So you can see I'm kind of moving in a certain direction where I've got this control, this notion of a controller and all the workers around it. And I'd like to write some software where it's really easy for me to deploy a Docker Compose file, basically, as a unit. And the control plane just deals with where to put it, what nodes to put it on. So I know you're going to say, that sounds a lot like Kubernetes. And I have, I've hosted Kubernetes and done all that. And of course it does that and has all the ingress and DNS and everything. But I tell you what, for me, I'm not hosting a Kubernetes cluster unless I'm getting paid to do it. It's just upgrading them it's such a pain, and I think it is fun to play around with. I think it's more fun to do in like a legitimate production setting, with real software. But for Homelab use, this is just me messing around and learning, and so I think I'm gonna have more fun. I have some ideas about writing a really simple sort of controller and deployer that sort of spreads out the workload across the machines. Another thing is DNS. So you can see I'm just using the host names of the machines, like worker one to go to look at transmission, and I have to know that transmission is being hosted there. It'd be really nice if I could just go to lab-transmission and I use DNS routing to go to the right machine and automating all that. Also automating all the Prometheus setup. So I walked you through it. It's not hard, but it's manual. So I need to go put that in the list and everything. I'd like to automate that. And I also have a little more to go over in terms of what I'm hosting. So I am hosting a little bit of home automation stuff that I didn't touch on. And the SSH keys kind of make for a unique development workflow. So with VS Code, I can just SSH from this Windows box in VS Code and edit files on those VMs, which is pretty cool. But anyway, definitely more Homelab videos to come. I hope you liked this one, and I'll see you in the next one.